Hello everybody and welcome to Unit 3. We're going to talk about a lot of interesting stuff this unit. The American Revolution. We'll look at the addition of new states to the Union after American independence, westward expansion, all these tensions that ultimately lead to the Civil War. But before we get to the American Revolution itself, we need to look at another war and see how its results actually start to lead to the creation of a uniquely American identity. And the war I'm talking about is the French and Indian War from 1754 to 1763. Sometimes it's also called the 7 Years' War because it was actually part of a much larger war in Europe of that name, a big war for empire. But in the Americas, it was typically just called the French and Indian War. One thing, I'll talk about this a little bit more in a second, a lot of my students in previous years have gotten a little confused by the name, and they think that the French were fighting against the Native Americans. They were actually allied together, so that's an important thing to realize. But let's just get into the background and the aftermath. So, the British population, as you already know, was expanding pretty rapidly in the colonies, and they very much wanted new land to settle. And so Foner mentions this sort of sketchy land grab. The government of Virginia ended up giving this land speculation company called the Ohio Company this big chunk of land, 500,000 acres in the Ohio River Valley. But here's the thing. It wasn't really their land to give because other people already lived there. The Eastern Woodland Native Americans had been living there for centuries, and there were also French settlers. They had established fur trading posts there, and they'd been there since the 1670s, so almost 100 years at this point. And the French and the Native Americans in general got along well. Okay, so that also helps us understand their alliance in this war. So in the early years, the British actually did not do so well, but as time went on, they were able to amass enough funds and enough troops to defeat the French, and they ended up expelling the French out of the territory that they wanted in the Northwest, right, present-day Ohio, this whole Ohio River Valley here. The French ended up retreating to New Orleans and their colonial possessions in the Caribbean. And that meant that the Native Americans in the region had lost their major ally. If you look at this map, you get a sense of how much land went to the British. It was huge, right? The French essentially lose all of their possessions in North America. So we will get to what's going on with Spain a little bit later, but really, effectively, the result of this war doubles the British land possessions in the North American continent. So that's huge. But it's not entirely a victory for the British. They amassed a great deal of debt from this war, and they needed to raise taxes in order to pay for it. So this actually effectively ends the period of salutary neglect, where the British basically let the colonies govern themselves and only really cared about their trading relationship with the colonies. And the taxes that they levied on the American colonists, they justified because they said that they fought this war to protect the colonies, but the colonies didn't really see it that way. And we'll get to that much more once we read about some of these taxes. Moving on to the aftermath, like I said previously, the Native Americans in the northwestern part of North America basically lost their French ally, and now they were really threatened by British expansion into their land. Because the British won all this territory, they were hoping to establish a presence there. And so the British really tried to make the lives of Native Americans in this region as difficult as possible. They ceased most of their trade with them, leaving them without ammunition, and the British also sometimes tried to restrict their ability to hunt and farm in these regions, so many of them starved. And so the most prominent example of Native Americans pushing back violently against the British expansion into their region was Pontiac's Rebellion. It's also sometimes called Pontiac's War because, as you can see on this map here, it wasn't just one isolated incident. This was a number of different skirmishes. So it was actually a series of attacks by a loose confederation of American Indian tribes. And their goal was to get rid of the British, right? They didn't want them to settle in their land. So they did things like seize British outposts that were established. So you see all these forts here. They were trying to take control of those. And they killed hundreds of white settlers that they came across. The British harshly retaliated. Not only did they retaliate militarily, but they also retaliated with germ warfare. So they purposely infected Native Americans with smallpox blankets that had smallpox on them. And germ warfare actually was more effective sometimes than military conflict because it spread so rapidly, since Native Americans were typically not immune to smallpox. Pontiac's rebellion, or Pontiac's war, whatever you want to call it, eventually ended in stalemate. Peace, loose peace at least, was established in the region, but what the British got out of this was it was really difficult for them to effectively protect settlers in the territories west of the Appalachians. They were just in way too much debt from the French and Indian War to be able to pay to have enough soldiers, enough of a presence to allow Americans to safely settle in the region. Okay, so that is why the Proclamation of 1763 actually was drawn, right? The Proclamation of 1763 was a boundary along the Appalachian Mountains, which prohibited English settlers from settling west of the line, right? But it's important for us to realize this isn't a physical line. It's not a fence, right? It's nothing tangible. It's literally just a line on a map. The goal of it was to preserve peace between American Indians and British settlers. But again, like I said, it wasn't an actual border. The British didn't have enough money to establish a military presence on the line, and the demand for land by the British settlers was just too great. So many settlers just crossed the line anyway. They either illegally squatted in the region or they illegally purchased land from Native Americans. And I think the most interesting part of the Foner reading last night was we found out that George Washington actually was one of those people that illegally purchased land. The proclamation ultimately failed then because it was really difficult to enforce. And it's an early indicator that the colonists wanted to self-govern. They really didn't want to listen to orders from the British anymore. And so the end of salutary neglect is not going to be welcomed by the British colonists. They, in a lot of ways, were really starting to think of themselves as a separate entity from the British. So this also demonstrates a continuing pattern of deteriorating relations between British settlers and American Indians. Clearly, this is not new. We already saw tension and violence with the Powhatan War, the Pequot War, two prominent examples. But there were some settlements that were a little bit more on the peaceful side, notably Pennsylvania, the Quakers, they were pacifists, but you're going to see more violent confrontations in other parts of the colonies as well. So speaking of Pennsylvania, the reading mentions the Paxton Boys in Pennsylvania who tried to attack the Moravian Indians near Philadelphia, and the Pennsylvania government's response was just to kick all the American Indians out of the land to prevent future conflict. So it's again a continuation of this long pattern of the expulsion of Native Americans from their land in order to clear the path for white settlement. Last thing that the reading talks about is the Albany Plan of Union. 1754, it was an idea by Ben Franklin, and what he wanted to do was create a council consisting of the members from all 13 of the colonies. It, again, was an idea only. The colonial assemblies ended up rejecting the idea, but it was seen as an early attempt for the colonies to band together and establish a collective defensive and economic set of policies. It was very much connected to the French and Indian War, right? The British, of course, were fighting on behalf of the colonies, but the colonies, since obviously this conflict was much more localized to them, they wanted to have the ability to independently establish some sort of collective defensive policy. They also wanted to be able to levy taxes to help pay for militias. And so it's interesting because this is the first example, even though it didn't happen, it was the first example of a plan for an intercontinental Congress, right? So the Albany Plan doesn't come to fruition, but many historians say that it planted a seed for what will eventually happen, the formation of a continental Congress. And that started meeting shortly before the Revolutionary War began. So it doesn't actually happen, but one could say that the Continental Congress was very much inspired by the ideas of Ben Franklin when he was trying to form the Albany Plan of Union. So hopefully you get a slightly better sense of how the American colonies are becoming a little bit more unique and distinct from Great Britain, even though this war, the French and Indian War, that is, was a British war. The Americas are really starting to develop separately from the British here, and that's hopefully the takeaway that you got. So we'll keep talking about the causes of the American Revolution next time. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.